So I've started this podcast to share the ideas and lessons I learned from reading timeless books on self-improvement, wealth, and worldly wisdom. My mission is to bring you valuable and timeless ideas so you can become better, richer, and wiser. And here's the cool part. If you take just one idea from an episode or from the entire podcast, the return on your time is still massive. Because one single idea can change the way you approach things, and over a lifetime, that compounds into something big. As Charlie Munger said, there are answers worth billions in a $30 history book. And that's why I chose The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb for the first episode of this podcast. A black swan, as Taleb defines it, is a rare and unpredictable event that has a massive impact. And the biggest takeaway is this: you cannot know the odds of these events happening, but you can know whether they are likely to benefit you or hurt you. Once you understand that, you can start designing your life so that uncertainty works in your favor and avoid situations where it can seriously harm you. I pulled together 21 ideas from The Black Swan, and some of them completely changed the way I see the world. But before getting into those ideas, I'll first give an introduction to the concept of the Black Swan. At the beginning of the book, Nassim Taleb tells why this particular type of bird, the black swan, is representative of the central idea in this book. He says, before the discovery of Australia, people in the old world were convinced that all swans were white, an unassailable belief as it seemed completely confirmed by empirical evidence. The sighting of the first black swan might have been an interesting surprise for a few ornithologists, but that is not where the significance of the story lies. It illustrates a severe limitation to our learning from observations or experience and the fragility of our knowledge. One single observation can invalidate a general statement derived from millennia of confirmatory sightings of millions of of millions of white swans. All you need is one single black bird. What we call here a black swan is an event with the following three attributes. First, it is an outlier, as it lies outside the realm of regular expectations, because nothing in the past can convincingly point to its possibility. Second, it carries an extreme impact. Third, in spite of its outlier status, human nature makes us concoct explanations for its occurrence after the fact, making it explainable and predictable. I stop and summarize the triplet: rarity, extreme impact, and retrospective predictability. Now, we can have negative black swans, where you are hurt by uncertainty, and positive black swans, where you are benefited from uncertainty. And Taleb writes, black swans being unpredictable, we need to adjust to their existence, rather than naively try to predict them. There are so many things we can do if we focus on anti-knowledge, or what we don't know. Among many other benefits, you can set yourself up to collect serendipitous black swans by maximizing your exposure to them. Indeed, in some domains, such as scientific discovery and venture capital investments, there is a disproportionate payoff from the unknown, since you typically have little to lose and plenty to gain from a rare event. We will see that, contrary to social science wisdom, almost no discovery, no technologies of note came from design and planning. They were just black swans. The strategy for discoverers and entrepreneurs is to rely less on top-down planning and focus on maximum tinkering and recognizing opportunities when they present themselves. So I disagree with the followers of Marx and those of Adam Smith. The reason free markets work is because they allow people to be lucky, thanks to aggressive trial and error, not by giving rewards or incentives for skill. The strategy is then to tinker as much as possible and try to collect as many black swan opportunities as you can. Now, on this idea of collecting positive black swan opportunities, I remember a tweet from Naval Ravikant where he made his own list of asymmetric opportunities. He tweeted, invest in startups, start a company, create a book, podcast, or a video, create a software product, go on many first dates, go to a cocktail party, read a indie book, which means a book that has stood the test of time and is still very relevant, move to a big city, buy Bitcoin, although I think here Taleb would disagree with Naval, and finally, tweet. Now, let's dive into the 21 ideas I picked from reading The Black Swan. Idea number 1, focus on the outliers. Taleb argues that the right way to study phenomena is to focus on the extremes and the outliers, rather than focusing on the ordinary, non-consequential observations. He says, there are two possible ways to approach phenomena. The first is to rule out the extraordinary and focus on the normal. The examiner leaves aside quote-unquote outliers and studies ordinary cases. The second approach is to consider that in order to understand a phenomenon, one needs first to consider the extremes, particularly if, like the black swan, they carry an extraordinary cumulative effect. I don't particularly care about the usual. If you want to get an idea of a friend's temperament, ethics, and personal elegance, you need to look at him under the tests of severe circumstances, not under the regular rosy glow of daily life. Can you assess the danger a criminal poses by examining only what he or she does on an ordinary day? Can we understand health without considering wild diseases and epidemics? Indeed, the normal is often irrelevant. Almost everything in social life is produced by rare but consequential shocks and jumps. All the while, almost everything studied about social life focuses on the quote-unquote normal, particularly with the quote-unquote bell curve methods of inference that tell you close to nothing. Why? Because the bell curve ignores large deviations, cannot handle them, yet makes us confident that we have tamed uncertainty. Its nickname in this book is GIF, Great Intellectual Fraud. Now, this idea from Taleb of focusing on the outliers reminded me of something that Warren Buffett said in the 1998 Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. He said, "The word anomaly I've always found interesting. What it means is something that the academicians couldn't explain. And rather than re-examine their theories, they simply just discard any evidence of that sort as anomalous. I mean, Columbus was an anomaly. I think when you find information that contradicts previously cherished beliefs, you've got a special obligation to look at it and look at it quickly." Elon Musk also has his own version of this idea. He says that in order to understand things, an important tool is to test things to the limit, which means to focus on the extremes. In a conversation with Lex Fridman, he said, "Another good physics tool is thinking about things in the limit. If you take a particular thing and you scale it to a very large number or to a very small number, how do things change? Take the example of manufacturing, which I think is a very underrated problem. So let's say you're trying to figure out, why is this product expensive? One, is it because of something fundamentally foolish that we're doing? Or two, is it because our volume is too low? So then you say, what if our volume was 1 million units per year? Is it still expensive? That's what I mean by thinking about things in the limit. If it's still expensive at 1 million units per year, then volume is not the reason why your thing is expensive. There's something fundamental about the design. So then you change the design part to be something that is not fundamentally expensive. That's a common thing in rocketry, because the unit volume is relatively low, and so a common excuse would be, well, it's expensive because our unit volume is low. And if we were in the automotive industry or consumer electronics, then our cost would be lower. And I'm like, okay, so let's say that now we're making 1 million units per year. Is it still expensive? If the answer is yes, then economies of scale are not the issue. So in that example from Elon Musk, we can see clearly how taking something to its limit or extreme is a great way to gain insight about the problem. Idea number 2, Platonicity. Taleb calls Platonicity the world of crisp forms and theoretical models, which contrast heavily with the real world, where forms are not crisp and the way it works is too complex to model. Taleb describes it this way. What I call Platonicity, after the ideas and personality of the philosopher Plato, is our tendency to mistake the map for the territory, to focus on pure and well-defined forms, whether objects like triangles or social notions like utopias, which are societies built according to some blueprint of what quote-unquote makes sense. When these ideas and crisp constructs inhabit our minds, we privilege them over other less elegant objects, those with messier and less tractable structures. Platonicity is what makes us think that we understand more than we actually do, but this doesn't happen everywhere. I'm not saying that Platonic forms don't exist. Models and constructions, these intellectual maps of reality, are not always wrong. They are wrong only in some specific applications, The difficulty is that A, you don't know beforehand, only after the fact, where the map will be wrong, and B, the mistake can lead to severe consequences. These models are like potentially helpful medicines that carry random but very severe side effects. The Platonic fold is the explosive boundary where the Platonic mindset enters in contact with messy reality, where the gap between what you know and what you think you know becomes dangerously wide. It is here that the Black Swan is produced. So my takeaway here is that it is useful to learn mental maps, but one should never take them as if they were a full representation of reality, because reality is always more complex than that. So if we can learn mental maps while being open-minded, I think that's the key. And of course, as you learn more or you get feedback from reality, you can also grade your mental maps. For instance, if you first thought that risks in the economy can be modeled with bell curve distribution, you will realize either by experience or by reading, this book, The Black Swan, or listening to Charlie Munger, you realize that risks actually follow a power law distribution. The great economist and hedge fund manager Ray Dalio also talked about this relationship between mental maps and open-mindedness. I want to read you a passage from his book, Principles. He said, "Imagine rating from 1 to 10 how good someone's mental map is on the y-axis and how humble or open-minded they are in the x-axis. Everyone starts out in the lower left area, with poor mental maps and little open-mindedness. And most people remain tragically and arrogantly stuck in that position. You can improve by either going up on the mental map axis by learning how to do things better, or out on the open-mindedness axis. Either will improve you with better knowledge of what to do. If you have good mental maps and low open-mindedness, that will be good but not great. You will still miss a lot that is of value. Similarly, if you have high open-mindedness but bad mental maps, you'll probably have challenges picking the right people and points of view to follow. The person who has good mental maps and a lot of open-mindedness will always beat out the person who doesn't have both. Now take a minute to think about your path to becoming more effective. Where would you place yourself on this chart? Ask others where they would place you. Once you understand what you're missing and gain open-mindedness, you will see that there's virtually nothing you cannot accomplish. Okay, now let's go to idea number 3, the anti-library. The next story offers an interesting solution to protect yourself against negative black swans. The solution is to build what Taleb calls an anti-library. I read to you the passage. The writer Umberto Eco belongs to that small class of scholars who are encyclopedic, insightful, and non-dual. He is the owner of a large personal library containing 30,000 books and separates visitors into 2 categories. Those who react, "Wow, Signore Professore Dottore Eco, what a library you have! How many of these books have you read?" And the others, a very small minority, who get the point that a private library is not an ego-boosting appendage, but a research tool. Read books are far less valuable than unread ones. The library should contain as much of what you don't know as your financial means allow you to put there. You will accumulate more knowledge and more books as you grow older, and the growing number of unread books on the shelves will look at you menacingly. Indeed, the more you know, the larger the rows of unread books. Let us call this collection of unread books an anti-library. We tend to treat our knowledge as personal property to be protected and defended. It is an ornament that allows us to rise in the pecking order. So this tendency to offend Eco's library sensibility by focusing on the known is a human bias that extends to our mental operations. People don't walk around with anti-resumes telling you what they have not studied or experienced. It's the job of their competitors to do that. But it would be nice if they did. Note that the Black Swan comes from our misunderstanding of the likelihood of surprises, those unread books, because we take what we know a little too seriously. Let us call an anti-scholar a skeptical empiricist, someone who focuses on the unread books and makes an attempt not to treat his knowledge as a treasure, or even a possession, or even a self-esteem enhancement device. Now, Charlie Munger has a great line on this idea of not treating your knowledge as a treasure. He said, any year that passes in which you don't destroy one of your best loved ideas is a wasted year. And also reminded me also of the co-founder of Airbnb, Brian Chesky, talking about this idea of never settling with what you currently know and always being in a constant place of becoming. And so I pulled this from his interview at the Lenny's podcast, where he said, I think that is the key. It's learning, it's growing, it's curiosity, it's constantly having that hunger and that fire to always want to be better, to feel like I haven't made it yet. The reason I say I haven't made it yet is because if I've made it, then I'm done. And I want to feel like an artist. Bob Dylan used to say an artist has to be in a constant place of becoming. And so long as they don't become something, then they're gonna be okay. Now let's go to idea number 4, scalable and non-scalable professions. Taleb classifies professional careers into 2 types: the scalable profession and the non-scalable profession. The scalable profession is black swan driven, and here you get paid by the quality of your decisions rather than your time and labor. So you don't need to be working all the time. As an example, think of book authors. If you're a successful author, you obviously don't need to labor like an accountant would have to. But of course, the nuance is that it's very hard to be a successful book author. There's only a very small minority that win at that game. It takes a black swan of the positive kind to be successful at a scalable profession. The other type, the non-scalable profession, doesn't have black swans. Here you get paid by the hour, and it demands continuous effort and labor. As an example, just think of any employee who gets paid a monthly salary, be it an accountant or a baker. Taleb says that in scalable professions, you have the idea person who sells an intellectual product in the form of a transaction or a piece of work, whereas in non-scalable professions, you have the labor person who sells you his work. And he writes, if you're an idea person, you don't have to work hard, only think intensely. You do the same work whether you produce 100 units or 1,000. In quant trading, the same amount of work is involved in buying 100 shares as in buying 100,000 or even 1,000,000. It is the same phone call, the same computation, the same legal document, the same expenditure of brain cells, the same effort in verifying that the transaction is right. Furthermore, you can work from your bathtub or from a bar in Rome. You can use leverage as a replacement for work. Well, okay, I was a little wrong about trading. One cannot work from a bathtub, but when done right, the job allows considerable free time. The same property applies to recording artists or movie actors. You let the sound engineers or projectionists do the work. There's no need to show up at every performance in order to perform. Similarly, a writer expends the same effort to attract one single reader as she would to capture several hundred million. J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books, doesn't have to write each book again every time someone wants to read it. But this is not so for a baker. He needs to bake every single piece of bread in order to satisfy each additional customer. So the distinction between writer and baker, speculator and doctor, fraudster and prostitute is a helpful way to look at the world of activities. It separates those professions in which one can add zeros of income with no greater labor from those in which one needs to add labor and time, both of which are in limited supply. In other words, those subjected to gravity. Now, Navarro-Kant also talks about leverage in careers. On the book, The Almanac of Navarro-Kant, he said the following. There are 3 broad classes of leverage. One form of leverage is labor, which is other humans working for you. It is the oldest form of leverage and actually not a great one in the modern world. I would argue this is the worst form of leverage that you could possibly use. Managing other people is incredibly messy. It requires tremendous leadership skills. Money is good as a form of leverage. It means every time you make a decision, you multiply it with money. Capital is a trickier form of leverage to use. It's more modern. It's one that people have used to get fabulously wealthy in the last century. It's probably been the dominant form of leverage in the last century. You can see this by looking for the richest people. It's bankers, politicians in corrupt countries who print money. Essentially, people who move large amounts of money around. If you look at the top of very large companies, outside the technology companies, in many large oil companies, the CEO job is really a financial job. It scales very, very well. If you get good at managing capital, you can manage more and more capital much more easily than you can manage more and more people. The final form of leverage is brand new, the most democratic form. It is products with no marginal cost of replication. This includes books, media, movies, and code. Code is probably the most powerful form of permissionless leverage. All you need is a computer, and you don't need anyone's permission. The most interesting and the most important form of leverage is the idea of products that have no marginal cost of replication. This is the new form of leverage. This was only invented in the last few hundred years. It started with the printing press, it accelerated with broadcast media, and now it's really blown up with the internet and with coding. You can multiply your efforts without involving other humans and without needing money from other humans. Okay, now Taleb also warns us about the scalable professions. He says that a scalable profession is only good is only good if you are successful. And it's way harder to be successful at the scalable It's way harder to be successful at a scalable profession compared to a non-scalable profession. So he says, if I myself had to give advice, I would recommend someone pick a profession that is not scalable. Now, this book The Black Swan was published in 2007, so it doesn't take much in consideration on this latest form of leverage, which is code and content creation on the internet. And although it's true that it's also very hard to be successful as a programmer making your own products or a content creator, we have definitely seen a huge rise in the number of people that are now making a living as an idea person by coding or making content on the internet. Now, this differentiation of scalable and non-scalable happens because we have two types of uncertainty, two types of randomness. On the scalable side, we have the black swan type of uncertainty, which we have seen is rare and consequential. And the non-scalable side, we have things that we can model with the bell curve, where there might be rare events, but these are inconsequential to the aggregate. And to expand on this fundamental distinction of uncertainties, Taleb comes up with two utopian provinces. The province of Mediocristan, where we have purely the non-scalable, and the province of Extremistan, where we have purely the scalable. So this leads to idea number 5, where I will explain the province of Mediocristan. Here's a quote from Taleb explaining this utopian province of Mediocristan. He says, let's play the following thought experiment. Assume that you round up 1,000 people randomly selected from the general population and have them stand next to one another in a stadium. Imagine the heaviest person you can think of and add him to that sample. Assuming he or she weighs 3 times the average, between 400 and 500 pounds, he or she will rarely represent more than a very small fraction of the weight of the entire population. In this case, about 0.5%. You can get even more aggressive. If you pick the heaviest biologically possible human on the planet, he or she wouldn't represent more than, say, 0.6% of the total. A very negligible increase. And if you had 10,000 persons, the contribution of the heaviest of the heavy would be vanishingly small. In the utopian province of Mediocristan, particular events don't contribute much individually, only collectively. I can state the supreme law of Mediocristan as follows. When your sample is large, no single instance will significantly change the aggregate or the total. The largest observation will remain impressive, but eventually insignificant to the sum. Taleb also gives the example of caloric consumption. No matter how much you eat in a single day, it will still be an insignificant amount when we compare it with the total of calories that a human can eat in a year, right? And so things like caloric consumption, human weight, these are domains that belong to the country of Mediocristan, where no single observation can be significant to the sum total of observations. Other areas from Mediocristan that Taleb mentions are height, income for a baker, a small restaurant owner, a prostitute, and then we have car accidents, mortality rates, and IQ. Now let's take a mental flight now and move to the province of Extremistan, which takes us to idea number 6, the province of Extremistan. Some examples that Taleb uses here are wealth and book sales. On wealth, he tells that if you put together 1,000 random people and then you add Bill Gates, and what happens is that Bill Gates' wealth would be over 99.99% of the total wealth of all the people there, right? And in a group of 1,000 random book authors, J.K. Rowling alone would have over 99.99% of the total volume of book sales. As we see, one single observation can contribute to most of the output in the world of Extremistan. So here's Taleb on Extremistan. In Extremistan, inequalities are such that one single observation can disproportionately impact the aggregate or the total. So while weight, height, and calorie consumption are from Mediocristan, wealth is not. Almost all social matters are from Extremistan. Another way to say it is that social quantities are informational, not physical. You cannot touch them. Money in a bank account is something important, but certainly not physical. As such, it can take any value without necessitating the expenditure of energy. It is just a number. Note that before the advent of modern technology, wars used to belong to Mediocristan. It is hard to kill many people if you need to slaughter them one at a time. Today, with tools of mass destruction, all it takes is a button, a nutcase, or a small error to wipe out the planet. Look at the implication for the black swan. Extremistan can produce black swans and does, since a few occurrences have had huge influences on history. This is the main idea of this book. So on things that belong to Extremistan, Taleb also mentions things like academic citations, media references, income, company size, name recognition as a celebrity, populations of cities, uses of words in a vocabulary, numbers of speakers per language, damage caused by earthquakes, deaths in wars, size of planets, stock ownership, financial markets, and so on. The renowned entrepreneur and investor Peter Thiel also says in his book 0 to 1, we don't live in a normal world. We live under a power law. And in this context, the word normal represents the Gaussian or Mediocristan, whereas the power law would represent Extremistan. A power law is simply the probability distribution that belongs to Extremistan. So we see an affinity here between what Peter Thiel says and the core idea from the Black Swan. Okay, let's go now to idea number 7, the problem of induction. One of the big problems in the world of Extremistan is the problem of induction, where people observe specific instances and then based on that, they come up with a general conclusion. To illustrate this problem, Taleb tells the story of the turkey. Consider a turkey that is fed every day. Every single feeding will firm up the bird's belief that it is the general rule of life to be fed every day by friendly members of the human race, quote unquote, looking out for its best interest, as a politician would say. On the afternoon of the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, something unexpected will happen to the turkey. It will incur a revision of belief. The rest of this chapter will outline the black swan problem in its original form. How can we know the future, given knowledge of the past? Or more generally, how can we figure out properties of the infinite unknown based on the finite known? Think of the feeding again. What can a turkey learn about what is in store for it tomorrow from the events of yesterday? A lot, perhaps, but certainly a little less than it thinks. And it is just that little less that may make all the difference. The turkey problem can be generalized to any situation where the same hand that feeds you can be the one that wrings your neck. So the turkey problem shows that learning from the past or learning from observations can be false, irrelevant, and even misleading. Learning from empirical data is very useful in Mediocristan, where the collective rules. But in the black swan-driven world of Extremistan, it's dangerous to reach a general conclusion from the observable data, because one single data point can change everything. Another example that Taleb gives is the long period of peace since the Napoleonic conflicts, which led people to believe in the disappearance of big wars. But then the Great War happened and took everybody by surprise. Taleb wrote, mistaking a naive observation of the past as something definitive or representative of the future is the one and only cause of our inability to understand the black swan. Those who believe in the unconditional benefits of past experience should consider this pearl of wisdom allegedly voiced by a famous ship's captain. But in all my experience, I've never been in any accident of any sort worth speaking about. I've seen but one vessel in distress in all my years at sea. I never saw a wreck, and never have been wrecked, nor was I ever in any predicament that threatened to end in a disaster of any sort. And those were the words of E.J. Smith, in 1907, captain of RMS Titanic. Captain Smith's ship sank in 1912 in what became the most talked about shipwreck in history. Now let's go to idea number 8, which is black swans are always relative to knowledge. This is something important to keep in mind. Taleb writes, from the standpoint of the turkey, the non-feeding of the Wednesday afternoon before Thanksgiving is a black swan. For the butcher, it is not, since its occurrence is not unexpected. So you can see here that the black swan is a sucker's problem. In other words, it occurs relative to your expectation. You realize that you can eliminate a black swan by science, if you are able, or by keeping an open mind. Of course, you can also create black swans with science, by giving people confidence that the black swan cannot happen. This is when science turns normal citizens into suckers. Now let's move to another problem which Taleb calls the round-trip fallacy. This is a problem that stems from the original problem of induction, where people make assumptions and general conclusions from the visible data. And the round-trip fallacy happens when people confuse the statement "no evidence of black swans" with evidence of no black swans. And I know it sounds confusing now, but Taleb gives an example, an illustration that explains this perfectly. He uses the example of cancer detection. He wrote, take doctors examining a patient for signs of cancer. Tests are typically done on patients who want to know if they are cured or if there is recurrence. It is not feasible in the present state of technology to examine every single one of the patient's cells to see if all of them are non-malignant. So the doctor takes a sample by scanning the body with as much precision as possible. Then she makes an assumption about what she didn't see. I was once taken aback when a doctor told me after a routine cancer checkup, "Stop worrying, we have evidence of cure." "Why?" I asked. "There's evidence of no cancer," was the reply. "How do you know?" I asked. He replied, "The scan is negative." Yet he went around calling himself a doctor. An acronym used in the medical literature is NED, N-E-D, which stands for no evidence of disease. There's no such thing as END, evidence of no disease. Yet my experience discussing this matter with plenty of doctors is that many slip into the round-trip fallacy during conversation. We can also see the round-trip fallacy in the turkey problem. It would be correct if before Thanksgiving the turkey says that there's no evidence of the possibility of a black swan event, but it would be incorrect if the turkey said instead that there is evidence of no possibility of a black swan event. Okay, now let's go to idea number 10, the error of confirmation, also known as the confirmation bias. This is our tendency to look for data that confirms our belief or hypothesis, while disregarding the data that disconfirms it. The problem here is that this is the opposite of science. In science, we will try to falsify a hypothesis. That is, to try to find that disconfirmatory evidence. Because disconfirmatory evidence gives us much more knowledge than confirmatory evidence. I read you Taleb on this issue. If I see a black swan, I can certify that all swans are not white. If I see someone kill, then I can be practically certain that he is a criminal. If I don't see him kill, I cannot be certain that he is innocent. The same applies to cancer detection. The finding of a single malignant tumor proves that you have cancer, but the absence of such a finding cannot allow you to say with certainty that you are cancer-free. We can get closer to the truth by negative instances, not by verification. It is misleading to build a general rule from absurd facts. Contrary to conventional wisdom, our body of knowledge doesn't increase from a series of confirmatory observations, like the turkeys. But there are some things I can remain skeptical about, and others I can safely consider certain. This makes the consequences of observations one-sided. Karl Popper generated a large-scale theory around this asymmetry based on a technique called falsification. To falsify is to prove wrong, and is meant to distinguish between science and non-science. This idea about the asymmetry of knowledge is so liked by practitioners because it is obvious to them. It is the way they run their business. And here, just to add another perspective to this idea, let me read you again an account from Warren Buffett from the 1998 Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. I think when you find information that contradicts previously cherished beliefs, you've got a special obligation to look at it and look at it quickly. I think Charlie Munger told me that one of the things Charles Darwin did was that whenever he found out anything that contradicted some previous belief, he knew he had to write it down almost immediately because he felt that the human mind was so conditioned to reject contradictory evidence that unless he got it down in black and white very quickly, his mind would simply push it out of existence. Okay, now let's go to idea number 11, the basis for true self-confidence. Taleb mentions how this process of looking for disconfirming evidence is perhaps the basis for true self-confidence, since it takes a great deal of confidence to try to prove your ideas wrong. Taleb gives the example of the speculator George Soros, who, when making a financial bet, keeps looking for instances that would prove his initial theory wrong. Ray Dalio has also talked about this on his book Principles. He says, "To be effective, you must not let your need to be right be more important than your need to find out what's true. If you are too proud of what you know or of how good you are at something, you will learn less, make inferior decisions, and fall short of your potential. If you are like most people, you have no clue how other people see things and are not good at seeking to understand what they are thinking, because you are too preoccupied with telling them what you yourself think is correct. In other words, you are close-minded, you presume too much. This close-mindedness is terribly costly. It causes you to miss out on all sorts of wonderful possibilities and dangerous threats that other people might be showing you, and it blocks criticism that could be constructive and even life-saving." So here again, we can see how being open-minded is an incredibly useful trait in order to not only avoid negative black swans, but also to benefit from black swans of the positive kind. And to be open-minded, you need to have self-confidence, a confidence that is not dependent on what others think of you, but on what you think of yourself. There's another dimension on this topic of self-confidence that Taleb talks about. I found it really interesting and worth sharing it. He says, "Humans will believe anything you say, provided you don't exhibit the smallest shadow of diffidence. Like animals, they can detect the smallest crack in your confidence before you express it. The trick is to be as smooth as possible in personal manners. It is much easier to signal self-confidence if you are exceedingly polite and friendly. You can control people without having to offend their sensitivity. The problem with business people," Nero realized, and Nero is a fictional character on the Black Swan, "is that if you act like a loser, they will treat you as a loser. You set the yardstick yourself. There is no absolute measure of good or bad. It is not what you are telling them, it is how you are saying it." Another perspective on this idea comes from the book The 48 Laws of Power, written by Rory Green. Law 34 is be royal in your own fashion, act like a king to be treated like one. And to illustrate this law, Rory Green uses the example of Christopher Columbus, and I found it really fascinating. He wrote, "As an explorer, Columbus was mediocre at best. He knew less about the sea than did the average sailor on his ships, could never determine the latitude and longitude of his discoveries, mistook highlands for vast continents, and treated his crew badly. But in one area he was a genius. He knew how to sell himself. How else to explain how the son of a cheese vendor, a low-level sea merchant, managed to ingratiate himself with the highest royal and aristocratic families? Columbus had an amazing power to charm the nobility, and it all came from the way he carried himself. He projected a sense of confidence that was completely out of proportion to his means. Nor was his confidence the aggressive, ugly self-promotion of an upstart. It was a quiet and calm self-assurance. In fact, it was the same confidence usually shown by the nobility themselves. The powerful in the old-style aristocracies felt no need to prove or assert themselves. Being noble, they knew they always deserved more, and asked for it. With Columbus, then, they felt an instant affinity, for he carried himself just the way they did, elevated above the crowd, destined for greatness. Understand, it is within your power to set your own price. How you carry yourself reflects what you think of yourself. If you ask for little, shuffle your feet, and lower your head, people will assume this reflects your character. But this behavior is not you. It is only how you have chosen to present yourself to other people. You can just as easily present the Columbus front, buoyancy, confidence, and the feeling that you were born to wear a crown. And then Robert Greene adds this fantastic quote from Nietzsche. With all great deceivers, there is a noteworthy occurrence to which they owe their power. In the actual act of deception, they are overcome by belief in themselves. It is this which then speaks so miraculously and compellingly to those around them. Okay, now let's move to idea number 12, the narrative fallacy. Taleb writes, the fallacy is associated with our vulnerability to overinterpretation and our predilection for compact stories over raw truths. It severely distorts our mental representation of the world. It is particularly acute when it comes to the rare event. The narrative fallacy addresses our limited ability to look at sequences of facts without weaving an explanation into them, or equivalently, forcing a logical link, an arrow of relationship upon them. Explanations bind facts together. They make them all the more easily remembered. They help them make more sense. Where this propensity can go wrong is when it increases our impression of understanding. So in the processing of information, we have this biological tendency to look for causality because it helps us make sense of the data. But this doesn't give us a real understanding. Rather, it gives us the illusion of understanding, right? Which is actually more dangerous than ignorance. As Stephen Hawking said, the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. And of course, in an increasingly more complex and black swan-driven world, the illusion of understanding is also increasingly more dangerous. Taleb also argues that this tendency to simplify, seek patterns and rules, reduce the dimensionality of matters, and put order makes us more likely to underestimate the role of randomness, since randomness represents disorder and the full dimensionality of matters. Therefore, Nassim Taleb says the black swan is what we leave out of simplification. So, is there a way to escape the narrative fallacy? Taleb argues that there is a way, by making conjectures and running experiments, by making testable predictions. On this, he says, the way to avoid the ills of the narrative fallacy is to favor experimentation over storytelling, experience over history, and clinical knowledge over theories. Being empirical doesn't mean running a lab in one's basement. It is just a mindset that favors a certain class of knowledge over others. I do not forbid myself from using the word cause, but the causes I discuss are either bold speculations, presented as such, or the result of experiments, not stories. Another approach is to predict and keep a tally of the predictions. Finally, there may be a way to use a narrative, but for a good purpose. Only a diamond can cut a diamond, so we can use our ability to convince with a story that conveys the right message, what storytellers seem to do. And on that last idea about using stories to convey the right message, I just want to add this famous line by Steve Jobs where he said, "The storyteller is the most powerful person in the room." Also, the author and NYU professor Scott Galloway said that if his children could learn one skill, it would be hands down storytelling, because your ability to convince people comes down to storytelling. And he says that is the premier skill among the most successful people. Okay, now let's move to number 13, silent evidence. Another fallacy in the way we understand events is that of silent evidence. To easily understand this fallacy, Taleb uses the story of the drowned worshippers. He writes, more than 2,000 years ago, the Roman orator Marcus Tullius Cicero presented the following story. One Diagoras, a non-believer in the gods, was shown painted tablets bearing the portraits of some worshippers who prayed, then survived a subsequent shipwreck. The implication was that praying protects you from drowning. Diagoras asked, where were the pictures of those who prayed, then drowned? The drowned worshippers, being dead, would have a lot of trouble advertising their experiences from the bottom of the sea. This can fool the casual observer into believing in miracles. We call this the problem of silent evidence. The idea is simple, yet potent and universal. Nassim Taleb argues that the problem of silent evidence is very acute in Extremistan, and because the few that win are visible and we hear about them, while we never hear of the cemetery of losers. On this, Taleb writes, the neglect of silent evidence is endemic to the way we study comparative talent, particularly in activities that are plagued with winner-take-all attributes. We may enjoy what we see, but there is no point reading too much into success stories because we don't see the full picture. Then Taleb gives the real-life example of the business of selling recipes for becoming a millionaire. He says, numerous studies of millionaires aimed at figuring out the skills required for hotshotness follow the following methodology. They take a population of hotshots, those with big titles and big jobs, and study their attributes. They look at what those big guns have in common: courage, risk-taking, optimism, and so on, and infer that these traits, most notably risk-taking, help you to become successful. Now take a look at the cemetery. It is quite difficult to do so because people who fail don't seem to write memoirs. And if they did, those business publishers I know would not even consider giving them the courtesy of a return phone call. Readers wouldn't pay $26.95 for a story of a failure, even if you convince them that it had more useful tricks than a story of success. The entire notion of biography is grounded in the arbitrary ascription of causal relation between specified traits and subsequent events. Now consider the cemetery. The graveyard of failed persons will be full of people who share the following traits: courage, risk-taking, optimism, etc. Just like the population of millionaires. There may be some differences in skills, but what truly separates the two is for the most part a single factor: luck. Plain luck. And as a thought experiment to demonstrate this, you can imagine a big enough sample of entrepreneurs or hedge funds. And when you consider this initial sample, then it is almost certain that you are going to have a few outliers that have a streak of good luck. So in order to avoid the distortion caused by the silent evidence, we should always consider the initial size of the sample, instead of focusing exclusively on the survivors or the winners. And although it may seem that Taleb is telling us here to not take risks, this is actually not true. He says, I'm not dismissing the idea of risk-taking, having been involved in it myself. I'm only critical of the encouragement of uninformed risk-taking. The Ober-psychologist Danny Kahneman has given us evidence that we generally take risks not out of bravado, but out of ignorance and blindness to probability. Okay, now let's move to idea number 14, which is the Ludic fallacy. This is actually one of my favorite ideas of the whole book. The word ludic comes from ludus in Latin, which means games. And the ludic fallacy happens because there's a huge difference between the attributes of uncertainty in games and exams and the attributes of uncertainty in real life. And people who fall for the ludic fallacy are essentially suckers who treat the uncertainty of real life as if it was the same type of uncertainty found in an exam or a game in the casino. So on this, Taleb says, in the casino, you know the rules, you can calculate the odds, and the type of uncertainty we encounter there is mild, belonging to Mediocristan. The casino is the only human venture I know where the probabilities are known, Gaussian, which is bell curve, and almost computable. You cannot expect the casino to pay out 1,000,000 times your bet, or to change the rules abruptly on you during the game. There are never days in which 36 black is designed to pop up 95% of the time. In real life, you don't know the odds. You need to discover them, and the sources of uncertainty are not defined. I recently looked at what college students are taught under the subject of chance and came out horrified. They were brainwashed with this ludic fallacy and the outlandish bell curve. The same is true of people doing PhDs in the field of probability theory. I'm reminded of a recent book by a thoughtful mathematician, Amir Axel, called Chance. Excellent book, perhaps, but like all other modern books, it is grounded in the Ludic fallacy. Now go read any of the classical thinkers who had something practical to say about the subject of chance, such as Cicero, and you find something different, a notion of probability that remains fuzzy throughout, as it needs to be, since such fuzziness is the very nature of uncertainty. Probability is a liberal art. It is a child of skepticism, not a tool for people with calculators on their belts to satisfy their desire to produce fancy calculations and certainties. Before Western thinking drowned in its scientific mentality, what is arrogantly called the Enlightenment, people prompted their brains to think, not compute. In a beautiful treatise now vanished from our consciousness, Dissertation on the Search for Truth, published in 1673, the polemist Simon Fouquet exposed our psychological predilection for certainties. He teaches us the art of doubting, how to position ourselves between doubting and believing. He writes, "One needs to exit doubt in order to produce science, but few people heed the importance of not exiting from it prematurely. It is a fact that one usually exits doubt without realizing it." He warns us further, "We are dogma-prone from our mother's wombs." Okay, so there's actually a fascinating real-life story that Taleb gives here, and it illustrates the danger of making decisions in the real world on the basis of theoretical models that rule out the possibility of unknown extreme events. The context for this story is the financial world, which is purely Extremistan, and the theoretical model used was the modern portfolio theory, which is based on the Gaussian distribution and therefore doesn't work in Extremistan. On this modern portfolio theory, actually, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger made some comments on the 1996 Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. Buffett said it has no utility, while Munger said it involves a type of dementia. I'll read you now the story from Taleb. Robert Merton Jr. and Myron Scholes were founding partners in the large speculative trading firm called Long-Term Capital Management, or LTCM. It was a collection of people with top-notch resumes from the highest ranks of academia. They were considered geniuses. The ideas of portfolio theory inspired the risk management of possible outcomes, thanks to their sophisticated quote-unquote calculations. They managed to enlarge the Ludic fallacy to industrial proportions. Then, during the summer of '98, a combination of large events, triggered by the Russian financial crisis, took place that lay outside their models. It was a black swan. LTCM went bust and almost took down the entire financial system with it, as the exposures were massive. Since their models rule out the possibility of large deviations, they allowed themselves to take a monstrous amount of risk. The ideas of Merton and Scholes, as well as those of modern portfolio theory, were starting to go bust. The magnitude of the losses were spectacular, too spectacular to allow us to ignore the intellectual comedy. Many friends and I thought that the portfolio theories would suffer the fate of tobacco companies. They were endangering people's savings and would soon be brought to account for the consequences of their Gaussian-inspired methods. None of that happened. Instead, MBAs in business schools went on learning portfolio theory. Now, in contrast to these people who fall in the Ludic fallacy, I found the perfect counterexample in some of the greatest scientists and creators, who highlight the importance of being humble about what we know and always remain skeptical. Here's Isaac Newton. "To myself, I am only a child playing on the beach, while vast oceans of truth lie undiscovered before me." Here's Richard Feynman. "I was born not knowing and have had only a little time to change that here and there." Here's Niels Bohr. "Every sentence I utter must be understood not as an affirmation, but as a question." And Elon Musk also said, "You should take the approach that you are wrong. Your goal is to be less wrong." The key here is that they are all aware that they always lack knowledge, and therefore they are aware that they cannot compute all the risks. So this mindset spurs them from falling in the Ludic fallacy, where people think they can compute all the risks as if it was a game in the casino. Okay, now let's move to number 15, epistemic arrogance and epistemic humility. This mindset of being aware that you lack knowledge is also known as epistemic humility, and it's useful to fight what Taleb calls epistemic arrogance. The epistemic arrogance happens when our increase in knowledge comes with an even greater increase in confidence, which make our increase in knowledge at the same time an increase in confusion, ignorance, and conceit. Taleb writes that epistemic arrogance bears a double effect. We overestimate what we know and underestimate uncertainty by compressing the range of possible uncertain states, for instance by reducing the space of the unknown. As we have seen, the opposite of epistemic arrogance is epistemic humility, and with regards to epistemic humility, Taleb says, someone with a low degree of epistemic arrogance is not too visible, like a shy person at a cocktail party. We are not predisposed to respect humble people, those who try to suspend judgment. Now contemplate epistemic humility. Think of someone heavily introspective, tortured by the awareness of his own ignorance. He lacks the courage of the idiot, yet has the rare guts to say, I don't know. He doesn't mind looking like a fool. He hesitates. He will not commit, and he agonizes over the consequences of being wrong. He introspects, and introspects until he reaches physical and nervous exhaustion. This doesn't necessarily mean that he lacks confidence, only that he holds his own knowledge to be suspect. And then Taleb goes on to say that his dream society is one in which anyone of rank is full of epistemic humility rather than epistemic arrogance. And when Taleb says that a person with epistemic humility doesn't mind looking like a fool, I couldn't help but recall a quote from the renowned psychiatrist Carl Jung, where he said, "The fool is the precursor to the savior." And also Fyodor Dostoevsky said, "The cleverest of all, in my opinion, is the man who calls himself a fool at least once a month." And I think the lesson here is that a person who genuinely wants to learn and understand things and doesn't care about looking smart will become very smart in the long run. Now let's move to idea number 16, the fire hydrant experiment. This is a fascinating experiment that shows the difficulty in changing our ideas and beliefs, and how sometimes more information leads to worse understanding. On this, Taleb writes, show two groups of people a blurry image of a fire hydrant, blurry enough for them not to recognize what it is. For one group, increase the resolution slowly, in 10 steps. For the second, do it faster, in 5 steps. Stop at a point where both groups have been presented an identical image and ask each of them to identify what they see. The members of the group that saw fewer intermediate steps are likely to recognize the hydrant much faster. What's the moral? The more information you give someone, the more hypotheses they will formulate along the way, and the worse off they will be. They see more random noise and mistake it for information. The problem is that our ideas are sticky. Once we produce a theory, we are not likely to change our minds. So those who delay developing their theories are better off. When you develop your opinions on the basis of weak evidence, you will have difficulty interpreting subsequent information that contradicts these opinions, even if this new information is obviously more accurate. Two mechanisms are at play here: the confirmation bias that we saw earlier, and belief perseverance, the tendency not to reverse opinions you already have. Remember that we treat ideas like possessions, and it will be hard for us to part with them. And this actually reminded me of author Robert Greene, an insight he offered on his book, The 48 Laws of Power. He said, science claims a search for truth that would seem to protect it from conservatism and the irrationality of habit. It is a culture of innovation. Yet, when Charles Darwin published his ideas of evolution, he faced fiercer opposition from his fellow scientists than from religious authorities. His theories challenged too many fixed ideas. Jonas Salk ran into the same wall with his radical innovations in immunology, as did Max Planck with his revolutionizing of physics. Planck later wrote of the scientific opposition he faced. He said, a new scientific truth doesn't triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. And this idea also relates to what Charlie Munger called the inconsistency avoidance tendency, which has a big influence in the formation of habits. In the book Portralis Almanac, he said, "The brain of man conserves programming space by being reluctant to change, which is a form of inconsistency avoidance. We see this in all human habits, constructive and destructive. Few people can list a lot of bad habits that they have eliminated, and some people cannot identify even one of these. Instead, practically everyone has a great many bad habits he has long maintained despite their being known as bad. Given this situation, it is not too much in many cases to appraise early formed habits as destiny. When Marley's miserable ghost in A Christmas Carol says, 'I wear the chains I forged in life,' he is talking about the chains of habit that were too light to be felt before they became too strong to be broken. The rare life that is wisely lived has in it many good habits maintained and many bad habits avoided or cured. The great rule that helps here is again from Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. What Franklin is here indicating, in part, is that inconsistency avoidance tendency makes it much easier to prevent a habit than to change it." If you're finding these ideas useful, you might want to check out my searchable database of insights, which I've built for the past 5 years, and it contains over 5,000 timeless ideas from world-class doers, thinkers, and entrepreneurs. I call this database Doer's Notebook. And the reason I built it is because I agree with that famous Latin motto which goes, "A chief part of learning is simply knowing where you can find a thing." And since it's all searchable, we only need to type a keyword to immediately get a list of insights related to it. For instance, if I'm unsure about how to get more sales in my business, I can simply type the word sales and immediately get 126 insights relevant to sales. In this case, from Jim Edwards, Peter Thiel, Naval Ravikant, Paul Graham, Sam Altman, Balaji Srinivasan, Nassim Taleb, and many other remarkable individuals. It's like having a second brain from which we can pull wisdom on demand to help us significantly decrease the error rate in our judgment and also get new perspectives on how to solve problems. As Naval Ravikant said, in an age of infinite leverage through code and media, judgment is the most important skill. And Alan Kay also said, "A change of perspective is worth 80 IQ points." So if this sounds interesting, just go to doersnotebook.com or find the link in the description below. Okay, and now moving to idea number 17, budget for uncertainty. On making plans and projections, Nassim Taleb argues that we systematically underestimate their duration and cost. And this happens because we never give space for the unknown unknowns. We only plan based on what we can see and think of. And uncertainty, the unknown unknowns, almost always have a one-sided effect on planning and projecting, which is a negative one, that either delays or makes the project more expensive. Just think of a house renovator making a projection. It almost always will end up taking longer and costing more than the initial projection. Taleb says, there is the nerd effect, which stems from the mental elimination of off-model risks, or focusing on what you know. You view the world from within a model. Consider that most delays and cost overruns arise from unexpected elements that didn't enter into the plan. That is, they lay outside the model at hand, such as strikes, electricity shortages, accidents, bad weather, or rumors of Martian invasions. These small black swans that threaten to hamper our projects do not seem to be taken into account. They are too abstract. We don't know how they look and cannot talk about them intelligently. We cannot truly plan because we don't understand the future. But this is not necessarily bad news. We could plan while bearing in mind such limitations. It just takes guts. It is often said that is wise he who can see things coming. Perhaps the wise one is the one who knows that he cannot see things far away. And now moving to idea number 18, ditch the 5-year plan. Here Taleb tells a personal story of when he worked at a European-owned financial institution back in 1998. He tells how every summer the 5 managers of the trading unit were supposed to meet in order to formulate the 5-year plan. To that, Taleb writes, A 5-year plan? To a fellow deeply skeptical of the central planner, the notion was ludicrous. Growth within the firm had been organic and unpredictable, bottom up, not top down. It was well known that the firm's most lucrative department was the product of a chance call from a customer asking for a specific but strange financial transaction. The firm accidentally realized that they could build a unit just to handle these transactions, since they were profitable, and it rapidly grew to dominate their activities. The managers flew across the world in order to meet and sat down to brainstorm during these meetings about, of course, the medium-term future. They wanted to have vision. But then an event occurred that was not in the previous 5-year plan: the black swan of the Russian financial default of '98 and the accompanying meltdown of the values of Latin American debt markets. It had such an effect on the firm that, although the institution had a sticky employment policy of retaining managers, none of the 5 was still employed there a month after the sketch of the 1998 5-year plan. Yet I am confident that today the replacements are still meeting to work on the next 5-year plan. We never learn. And this story from Nassim reminded me of an interview I watched of the founder of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, where he said, "Very few people know this, but I don't wear a watch. And the reason why I don't wear a watch is now is the most important time. You will be surprised. I'm not at all ambitious. I don't aspire to do more. I aspire to do better at what I'm currently doing. I'm not reaching for more. I wait for the world to come to me." People who know me also knows that NVIDIA doesn't have a long-term strategy. We have no long-term plan. Our definition of a long-term plan is, what are we doing today? And Charlie Munger also talked about the dangers of planning. He said, "At Berkshire, there has never been a master plan. Anyone who wanted to do it, we fired because it takes on a life of its own and doesn't cover new reality. We want people taking into account new information." Okay, and now moving to idea number 19, maximize the serendipity around you. Taleb argues that the process of innovation is almost entirely driven by trial and error and lucky accidents. In the same way, he says that in life, one should be exposed to the possibility of positive accidents to maximize the serendipity around you, so that you have the chance to get lucky. But many people don't do this because they are afraid of failure, even when these failures are not consequential. Taleb writes, "We have psychological and intellectual difficulties with trial and error, and with accepting that series of small failures are necessary in life. My colleague Mark Spitznagel understood that we humans have a mental hang-up about failures. You need to love to lose," was his motto. In fact, the reason I felt immediately at home in America is precisely because American culture encourages the process of failure, unlike the cultures of Europe and Asia, where failure is met with stigma and embarrassment. America's specialty is to take these small risks for the rest of the world, which explains this country's disproportionate share in innovations. Once established, an idea or a product is later, quote-unquote, perfected over there. And just to add here another perspective, I always love this line by Peter Thiel, where he said, "There's always the risk of doing something that's not that significant or meaningful. You could say a track in law school is a low-risk track from one perspective, but it may still be a very high-risk track in the sense that maybe you have a high risk of not doing something meaningful with your life." Number 20, look for asymmetric outcomes. Taleb says, "Put yourself in situations where favorable consequences are much larger than unfavorable ones." Indeed, the notion of asymmetric outcomes is the central idea of this book. I will never get to know the unknown, since by definition it is unknown. However, I can always guess how it might affect me, and I should base my decisions around that. This idea is often erroneously called Pascal's wager after the philosopher and thinking mathematician Blaise Pascal. He presented it something like this: "I don't know whether God exists, but I know that I have nothing to gain from being an atheist if he doesn't exist, whereas I have plenty to lose if he does. Hence, this justifies my belief in God." This idea that in order to make a decision, you need to focus on the consequences, which you can know, rather than the probability, which you cannot know, is the central idea of uncertainty. Much of my life is based on it. And one of my favorite stories on looking for positive asymmetries is this story from Richard Branson when he was starting his airline, Virgin. Most people would think that he took a lot of risk when he started the airline, but he actually took a very limited risk because he went to Boeing and negotiated a deal where they could send the planes back if it didn't work out and he wasn't liable. So I like this example because it's not just about someone looking for asymmetries, it's someone who is obsessed with asymmetries. His first question to every business is, what's the downside and how do I protect it? Now let's go to idea number 21, set up your own game. This is actually one of my favorite ideas from the entire book, and I have applied it in my life ever since I first read it back in 2022. Taleb writes, I once received another piece of life-changing advice, which I find applicable, wise, and empirically valid. My classmate in Paris, the novelist to be Jean Oliver Tedesco, pronounced, as he prevented me from running to catch a subway, I don't run for trains. Snub your destiny. I have taught myself to resist running to keep on schedule. In refusing to run to catch trains, I have felt the true value of elegance and aesthetics in behavior, a sense of being in control of my time, my schedule, and my life. Missing a train is only painful if you run after it. Likewise, not matching the idea of success others expect from you is only painful if that's what you're seeking. You stand above the rat race and the pecking order, not outside of it, if you do so by choice. Quitting a high-paying position, if it is your decision, will seem a better payoff than the utility of the money involved. This may seem crazy, but I've tried and it works. This is the first step toward the Stoics throwing a 4-letter word at fate. You have far more control over your life if you decide on your criterion by yourself. Mother Nature has given us some defense mechanisms. As in Aesop's fable, one of these is our ability to consider that the grapes we cannot or did not reach are sour. But an aggressively stoic, prior disdain and rejection of the grapes is even more rewarding. Be aggressive. Be the one to resign, if you have the guts. It is more difficult to be a loser in a game you set up yourself. In Black Swan terms, this means that you are exposed to the improbable only if you let it control you. You always control what you do. So make this your end. Now I want to go back to this line where Taleb says you have far more control over your life if you decide on your criterion by yourself. Because it reminded me of something I learned from Peter Thiel again. And he says that one of the reasons for why we tend to blindly follow other people's criterion instead of our own criterion is that humans feel safety in the crowds. We feel validated when we pursue things that other people are pursuing too. On an interview at the London School of Economics, Peter Thiel put it this way. There's something where we find competition strangely reassuring. We find it validating when you compete for things where there are lots of people doing it. And there's sort of this perception of safety in the crowds. If a lot of people are trying to get something, it must be valuable. Whereas if nobody's trying to do something, that's already really uncomfortable. And I think the word ape, already in the time of Shakespeare, meant both primate and to imitate. And there is this rather disturbing aspect of human nature where people are ape-like, sheep-like, lemming-like, unbelievably herd-like, and we're sort of attracted to doing things that other people do. We are attracted to compete for all these things and compete the most intensely for things that often matter the least. And that's where I'll leave it. I highly recommend buying the book. If you buy it using the link in the description below, you will be supporting the podcast at no extra cost to you. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and I will talk to you again soon.